Good evening, all panelists. My name is Jesse. I've been working in Canada for 3 years, still a Malaysian citizen, and intend to go back to Malaysia one day. Right? Definitely. And I voted for the opposition over the past 2 elections. My question to the panelists is, with the Sedition Act being in full force and being an ordinary citizen, I believe that the government will not backtrack no matter what the opposition has done or no matter what the opposition is doing in order to enlighten the people. What is the opposition's next move, and how will Pakatan Rakyat survive without YB Yang Amat Berhormat Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim? Because as you can see in the political sphere of Malaysia, since 1998, Pakatan Rakyat has been glued by Yang Amat Berhormat Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim, with, of course, the assistance of PAS and DAP. Now suddenly you will find a very different atmosphere, taking into consideration the relationship between the 3 parties due to the Selangor affair recently. Thank you.
Another 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll start the
Back then, for many years, there seemed to be a resignation that Malaysia will never ever escape from the fear of ISA. But it was repealed in 2011. 40 years worth of struggle and campaigns did result in finally Barisan Nasional admitting that maintaining ISA would no longer be tenable. And ISA is much bigger menace than Akta Hasutan. So I think if you see how Pakatan Rakyat or activists have reacted to the latest crackdown using Akta Hasutan, I think we have accepted it and welcomed it with much merriment. I remember the first public rally at KL Selangor Chinese Assembly Hall to launch the Gerakan anti-ISA. The rallying call at that time is, let's menghasut as much as possible. You know, the more you use draconian laws like Akta Hasutan, the more there will be an equally strong response from the public to oppose. And you, in my opinion, you will just hasten the repeal of Akta Hasutan. So I'm not too concerned. In fact, I think they have charged almost 220 people. The process to bring the case to court itself will take about 4 or 5 years at least, by which time Najib and Rosmah will not be there, for all we know. And so many things will happen in the next 4 or 5 years. Even if Najib or Rosmah or anyone else is still there in the next 4 or 5 years, it's not as easy to convict us in a court of law on flimsy charges like Akta Hasutan. I personally think that the crackdown was more to intimidate, and it was more because of the internal struggle and split within UMNO. Those who follow Malaysian politics very closely would have realized by now that there is a gathering momentum within UMNO to challenge Najib. The argument is that in spite of Najib's attempt to be more liberal and reform-minded, although reform, when you associate to UMNO, must be seen in the most relative manner, BN and UMNO continue to lose votes and continue to be denied two-thirds majority. So there is a more conservative element within UMNO that thinks that if Najib continues to be Prime Minister, leading to the next general election, that will be the end of UMNO's rule. And the momentum is gathering to challenge his premiership. And against that backdrop, I think it was important for Najib to prove that he too has balls, you know, for the lack of a better word. So that's why the easiest way to do it is to use Akta Hasutan. So I'm not too concerned about Akta Hasutan. After all, I have 3 criminal charges. I have 5 defamation suits. I'm still here, you know, we still go around. And if you've been in the business that we have been in the last 16 years, which is to bring down Barisan Nasional, being charged is a badge of honor. And if I were to end up in prison for 1 or 2 years, it's just an escape, or you should consider it as paid holiday for 1.5 years.
Free food.
So, free food. So, your tax money basically. So it's not a big deal. You know, if you ask, if your question then whether the latest crackdown, using Sedition Act is really going to rattle us, I don't think so. That's not the issue. Your second question is a bit more difficult. My view is this: while Anwar Ibrahim presence or absence, physical presence or absence, will not decide the breaking out of Pakatan Rakyat, it is also true that Anwar Ibrahim has been perhaps the single most successful glue whose moral authority has managed to bring Pakatan Rakyat where it is today. If Anwar Ibrahim is not around to lead Pakatan Rakyat, I do not see Pakatan Rakyat breaking out. If there is most important silver lining out of the Selangor crisis, in retrospect, I think it has proven that Pakatan Rakyat is very agile and flexible. In any other normal or other political coalition, not just Malaysia, also anywhere around the world, such public spares and serious differences would have broken down a political coalition. Surprisingly, we are still there. In fact, at the beginning of the last of this parliamentary session, the budget session, UMNO was really taken by surprise because they thought that after about a few months of what they think was public bickering, we would have gone to parliament being awkward with each other and really at the loss about how to confront them. That was not the case. We still managed to launch our alternative budget. There are still concerted attacks against UMNO, and it didn't take long for UMNO ministers to make stupid comments in parliament to shift the tide around. So I think Pakatan Rakyat is a lot more flexible and strong and agile that with or without Anwar Ibrahim, it is going to be there. After all, the main engine of Pakatan Rakyat is the second tier leadership. It's no longer the first leadership. It is the 30s, the early 40s who really run Pakatan Rakyat. It has always been like that. However, without Anwar Ibrahim at the helm of Pakatan Rakyat, decision-making process will be a bit more difficult because we have to acknowledge that it is his moral authority that can be imposed and that can influence leadership of the other two parties. It's also a more question of generational gap. The average age of PKR leadership is late 30s and early 40s. My counterpart in PAS is as old as my grandfather. So you can imagine in a meeting, we have 3 Secretary General for the 3 parties. It will be not as easy to convince Mustafa Ali, for example, because he's been in politics before I was conceived. Not before I was born. I was not even conceived. He was already a minister. So I cannot imagine how he would look at me. His counterpart from PKR. It's really young. So it's not so much that we cannot run Pakatan, but the generational gap in terms of age is a factor. And without Anwar Ibrahim, the decision-making process perhaps is going to be slower, and if you are not careful, it may affect the effectiveness of Pakatan Rakyat as a whole. The good thing is, I think, before I end and perhaps pass to other colleagues, the good thing about Pakatan Rakyat, from my experience, and I have represented PKR in the leadership of Pakatan Rakyat for the last 4 or 5 years. The good thing is, unlike Barisan Nasional, Pakatan Rakyat is actually governed by a set of signed consensus and agreements. There is an official agreement that outlines our policies in most, if not all, major areas, in education, in finance, in social programs. There are agreements in the most sensitive problem or position, policy positions, in terms of the position of Bumi Putra, special position of Malay Putra in terms of the role and position of Islam as the official religion of the Federation, in terms of the high regard that we give, that we accord to the system of constitutional monarchy. These are all difficult questions that have been agreed, ironed out, and signed and cast in stone among the three parties. Now, of course, there are still 2 or 3 issues. Hudud is one of it, for example, that remains a thorn. But I think it has been narrowed down, and disagreements, I think, will be managed within the discipline and culture that Pakatan Rakyat has developed over the years. So I'm quite optimistic. I think if Anwar is not around, it may slow us down a bit. But then for every problem that we had, there's always opportunity. When Anwar was sacked in 1998, Anwar was abandoned. The older Malaysian political elites completely abandoned Anwar Ibrahim. And the only idiots around who actually go down and thought that we could topple Mahathir within 2 months were basically the students. Of course, we didn't topple Mahathir within 2 months. But 16 years later, most of us are MPs, and we form the backbone of the opposition movement that we have today. If Anwar is sacked again, is imprisoned again, I'm sure you will see a similar political awakening to the younger generation. Maybe there will be 4 or 5 new MPs from amongst the crowd tonight, inspired by the resilience that he has shown in pushing for reform. So we can continue to remain hopeful. What is important is that you must be part of that change, and I think with more and more people joining, whether or not Anwar is around physically is a question that we can manage together. Thank you very much.
And the youth wing. So I have a good working relationship with, as the youth leader of the party, of PKR, with my counterparts, Suhaizan and Teo Kok Siong, and we've done many meetings together. Of course, if you've been following the news, we've made comments as well about our party leadership when things were heading into a problem. But at the same time, we maintain that ultimately Pakatan has to work. Because I think if there's any realization that we can get from Malaysia's history, is that there is a cultural imperative for coalitions. That was the secret behind the alliance and Barisan success for so long, and why the opposition failed to challenge them for so long, because there was no viable coalition at the opposition level. And now, why is Pakatan so strong? Not so much, it's a sub greater than its own. It's not so much because of PKR per se, or DAP or PAS per se, as much as I would like to say, but it is because of Pakatan, and people seeing that the three parties are offering a united front against Barisan. So I think that is, I think will always be there. Of course, we cannot deny that Datuk Sri Anwar has played a major role, but ultimately life goes on, and I think that people will continue to want a better Malaysia, and I think if all the three parties in Pakatan bear in mind with that, then I think we are definitely heading in the right direction.
Just a little bit. As much I thought that I control your life by deciding your water bills, but actually not. Actually, you guys decide whether Pakatan or Rakyat should split or hold it together. It is you. You have to decide. A lot of times, the voters, when you voice out, we listen. Okay, and I think an example when during the height of this Selangor crisis, I also very, being still very younger, same age as you guys. So I was critical of certain past leaders, and I got whacked right, right, center by other people. They said that, hey, you guys should be staying together, don't fight each other. So that lessons to that makes us disciplined as a coalition, and I think If you guys continue to voice out to us, we will continue to be holding together.
What do you call that? I think, just briefly, I think keeping very reminding that we were founded as a constitutional monarchy from day one. And in fact, our first Prime Minister, who is a royalty himself, Tunku Abdul Rahman, he managed to remind the rulers of that principle. I think we have to go back to that original spirit of the country when we look back at how things should be run in the country. As about East Malaysia, it's unfortunate that Daryl could not be here. But Keadilan is actually the only truly national party in Malaysia as well as Pakatan. We are the only party that has YBs in every single state, and we have Malays, Chinese, Indians, Ibans, Kadazans in our party. And while it's true that the AP has done very well in Sarawak, for example, and I'm not trying to belittle the achievements, but what Keadilan has achieved in Sarawak, we have 3 seats. One is a Chinese seat, which is obviously easy to win. It's urban, information is there. But we also want 2 Dayak seats in Sarawak, and that's where the challenge is. This is the interior where Barisan has always been able to win with the politics of patronage. So I think the key is, and how do we win those 2 seats as opposed to the other seats where we lost? It was by having a long established presence on the ground with good personalities who's been well known in the local communities. For example, Barubian is a well-known lawyer for NCR cases. Ali Biju is a local entrepreneur. Those things were very helpful to Keadilan, and Sabah as well. People like Daryl and all that have been breaking new ground. But obviously it's not enough. The number of seats we received were not enough. If it was just the peninsula, I think we were just short of a few seats.
There are only 2 seats extra.
BN only won 2 seats extra. Yeah, something like that. 1 or 2 seats in Peninsular Malaysia. But the challenge is in East Malaysia. So I think that means a lot more investment in terms of time, energy, people on the ground, and working early. So I think that's the challenge for the party. And we have learned from the lessons of 2011 Sarawak election and GE.
Okay, soalan susah, monarki. I'm sure the questions being asked within the context, especially what happened in Islam. I think we have to put it in context before we can begin to answer. Malaysia has had constitutional monarchy system since 1957. There were only a few incidents. Basically, throughout the 60 years of our nationhood, there were only 2 or 3 major incidents with the monarchy. And it was in 1974 when the late Sultan Perak at the time refused to accept Tan Sri Ghazali, the late Sultan Idris. So the appointment was delayed for about 1 or 2 weeks. And finally, he actually grew a beard. Yeah, the story was he refused to shave, until a different nominee was sent to the palace. Had he refused to appoint, he would have had a panjang janggut gila lah. But after 2 weeks, the Sultan yielded, and Tan Sri Ghazali was appointed. In 1983, there was another constitutional crisis, so to speak. It wasn't too much a constitutional crisis, but Mahathir's administration wanted to push for constitutional amendments so that royal assent become automatic. You guys were way too young, I think. You guys were born in 1990s when I was about to finish my SPM. So you wouldn't remember 1983. So there was a minor skirmish, and since then royal assent was not necessary for the passing of a bill. It will become automatic. In 1994, it was a lot more serious. In fact, it was the most serious open attack by UMNO against the royalty. I was 17, and day after day we read in Utusan. Yeah, I read Utusan at that time. Day after day was Kereta Raja, you know, the sports car of the Sultan, the bungalows, everything. Yeah, Kuda Raja would feature on the headlines of Utusan. Again, I think the monarchy yielded, and a special court to try the rulers was set up in 1994. Now, the reason I gave that, basically I think we have to acknowledge and accept that for a good 40 years or so, we did not have too much of an issue with the constitutional monarchy system. Perhaps the only problem began to show some signs was in the aftermath of 2008. Even though I don't think, in my opinion, that it was systemic, it's something systemic. It was more isolated individual preference of the Sultan. We had a case in Terengganu and we had a case in Perlis. Although the case in Perlis, a different faction had managed to demonstrate to the ruler that Shahidan Qasim had lost majority by way of statutory declaration. Therefore, that's why he was not appointed. So, all in all, basically what I'm trying to say, in our barring what had happened with Selangor, it was only in 2008 with the appointment of the Terengganu Menteri Besar that the so-called role of constitutional monarchy had been questioned. Now, of course, I do not have to explain the prolonged confrontation that we had with the palace in appointing a new Menteri Besar. If you ask me how do we manage it, I think we manage it the only way that we can manage it, which is to stick to the principle of democracy, to the constitution, and to adhere to the principles of constitutional monarchy, because that is the only way for us to protect the sanctity of the royal institution. Little that people forget, in 1982, when the late Sultan Azlan was still the Lord President, he had reminded his fellow rulers that if rulers do not take heed of the changes in the society, rulers will one day become relic of the museum. I did not say that. A fellow Agong, a previous Agong, and a Sultan actually reminded his own fellow rulers in 1982. So it is in the best interest of the royal institution that what have been agreed and embodied by the constitution, we have to defend to the fullest, because that spirit, that agreement that is embodied in the constitution is the social contract that was meant to retain the power in the people's hand, and that has spelled out successfully what are the boundaries, what are the rules, and where royal institutions feature in the system of constitutional monarchy. And I think we have done exactly just that throughout the Selangor crisis. We have, we did not yield. We have maintained our position that the person who commands the majority support in the Dewan has to be appointed. You see, the constitution does not say that a monarch selects a Menteri Besar. Constitution states specifically that a monarch appoints a Menteri Besar subject to a precondition that that Menteri Besar must be a member of the Legislative Assembly who commands the support, the majority support of the others. Very straightforward. And based on that principles, we have maintained our position in the face of perhaps the most open criticism from the palace against us, and we were risking public support because of that, but we did not yield. We did not yield because it is important to defend the basis of constitution that has spelled out where and how our system must work within the context of constitutional monarchy. So if you ask me if that were to happen again, I think we will continue to do exactly what we did before. Of course, you have to take into account certain prevailing political situations. In the case of Selangor, we realized that we could not drag much further than September, because if you were to drag, the intention of UMNO and our political opponents was to push the crisis into November, and where in all probability the Legislative Assembly would be dissolved in November, and the calculation was after 2-3 months of confrontation with the palace, we will hemorrhage Malay support and we may lose the state altogether. So when you combine that prevailing political situation, then we thought that it was prudent for us, while we have shown how steadfast we can be in defending the principle, there has to be a turning point that we have to move on, and that was the decision that we made. So there is no other way, or there is no strategy. We must fall back to what is in the constitution. And we are the only opposition party in the whole country with a MP of Bumiputra, of non-Muslim Bumiputra, from non-Muslim Bumiputra, which is Saudara Daryl from Penambang. So I think we have to be a bit more patient and continue to do what we have been doing. There will come a point, there is a critical mass. And looking at Sabah, the way Sabahans had voted in the past, they have changed government 4 times. And I think if we persevere, it is very possible that that change can happen in Sabah. It's slightly more difficult in Sarawak because the grand old man is no longer there. In my case, it's even more difficult because I'm banned from Sabah. Sarawak. I've been deported 3 times from Sarawak. The last time I was deported, I was advised by the immigration officer never to return to the state. If I want to return to the state, the advice was perhaps I should kahwin dengan orang Sarawak. You know, that gives an excuse to go back to Sarawak. It will be a bit more difficult in Sarawak because there is a regime change. Tan Mahmud is no longer there. The new Ketua Menteri Anand Satim seems to do some of the right things with the public to manage the public anger. So I think we will concentrate more in Sabah. The momentum is gaining in Sabah. And even if you cannot break the monopoly in both states, if we make breakthrough and we win Sabah with considerable seats in Sarawak, I think that is enough to tilt the balance at the federal level. Thank you very much.
Maybe just to add a bit, since you mentioned East Coast, which is Pahang and partly Johor, because to me Pahang is quite similar to Sarawak in a way, but of course it's nearer to big capital like Kuala Lumpur and other big cities. But if you look at Pahang, I mean, my personal observation is that activists or concerned citizens at large always have a very different perception on how to change or bring wind of change to rural areas. It's actually not what we expect when we go to the ground. Like what Rafizi said, is about how you visit the Rumah Panjang in Sarawak. So, I mean, similarly, Pahang is about how you really strengthen your grassroots in the rural areas, in semi-urban areas, how you maintain rapport with the local community, how do you buy the heart over, how do you run continuous program. If you talk about democracy, human rights, universal values, we cannot be talking about it every time at KL or Klang Valley. We have to bring all these values to out of greater KL. I bumped into some friends from Myanmar, and I'm always impressed by their initiative and efforts to bring workshops to very rural area. It will take you about 8 hours to reach a kampong in Myanmar to talk about constitution. But how many of us really spend time to go to, say, Kampung Orang Asli in Pahang, or Gunung Tahan or Tahan? It will take you 4 hours boat to the upstream of Tahan. Yeah? There are still some villages there. How can we really form a formidable and practical civil societies that not just concentrated in Klang Valley? And I think in previous sessions we also bumped into some very important but could be a bit of theoretical question, like why Pakatan Rakyat is not forming a shadow cabinet. Yeah? But that question comes timely, yeah, for us to reflect, yeah, to think about it. But at the same time, I mean, we should also think about that in our parliament. We don't have any resources to be on par or compete. We don't have access to information to what ministries are doing. I think YB Sim has been in parliament for more than a year, but he only met foreign minister 1 time in the parliament. Our minister just don't go to the parliament. They rather go to the 5-star hotel. So these are all the problems, very down to earth, very practical problems that we should also take into consideration, yeah, before we provide or we come up with alternative suggestions. I think all of us to think about it is a very important thing. And my personal experience in Dewan Undangan Negeri Pahang or Pahang State Assembly is that if you try to be very logical or rational, you don't expect a very rational result. I asked about something I commented about budget last year because of oil royalty issue. Yeah, Pahang received, it's not royalty, but Pahang received Wang Esan, amounted to 100 million a year starting this year. Sounds rich, yeah, but Pahang is still poor. Anyway, so I said the budget surplus is fake, it's not right because you have taken the 100 million into consideration. So as a result, instead of criticizing me or, arguing, debating with me, he actually suspended me. Not too long, 1 year. 1 year. So when I shared this in the parliament of, in Canberra just now, oh, like shocked. Yeah, but the very grand old man not just exists in Sarawak, but also in Pahang. Yeah, also, he can throw out words like anjing pun ada otak, babi pun ada otak in the Dewan, but it's alright. But I'm the one who is kicked out from the Dewan. So the stark contrast reminds us a lot of work to be done, not just in Klang Valley, not just Penang, maybe not just big cities, but also in smaller towns where most of you are coming from. Thank you.
Easy explanation about Pakatan Rakyat, which is based on consensus. But unfortunately, when you look how Kajian Move was constructed, it's not so much consensual. It was done by the so-called elite of PKR itself. So how do you reconcile your rhetoric with your actions then? Which is, I think, it is very pertinent, in the formation, coalition building, of a newly coalition like Pakatan Rakyat. That's my first question. And my second question is related to the second gentleman who are, asking about the monarchy. This is not a difficult question, but it's a practical question. If I'm not mistaken, in Article 53 or something in the Selangor Constitution, which actually, if you read it, carefully, it's quite ambiguous. There's an ambiguity, on the role of the monarch. If I'm not mistaken, there is a word like in his judgment. There is also a word, shall appoint a person who is likely. So this is very ambiguous, Despite, you are saying that, this is a constitutional monarch, but the wording of the Selangor Constitution itself gives a kind of a leeway, to the monarch, to decide. My question is, now that you have power in Selangor, would you be able to amend such an ambiguity in Selangor Constitution to make it more clear, so that the Sultan shall appoint without using in his judgment or or other ambiguous word. Will you do it? Because you have power. The way I see it, that PKR Pakatan Rakyat is always blaming UMNO or Barisan Nasional. But now you have power. Can you do it? My other question is also related. If I talk too much, you can stop me. Okay.
We can bring a chair if you want to be a panelist outside. It will be a bit more lively if we have some differing opinions. But go ahead, you can ask your third question.
Okay, my third question is about, for example, also several other words, which is part of the Selangor Constitution. So my question
Not
is
constitution, it's part of Selangor enactment.
Okay.
It's two different things.
Okay, but still, it is law which you have power to amend. You see? So you have a power to amend. But then, what are you going to do with it? I know the intricacies, of the political stuff and everything, but you have power. So, people will question. Don't take, people as stupid. Because you have power to do it. But why don't you do it?
Okay. Let me try to answer as much, and then I think maybe Nick and Sim will answer as well. On the question of consensus, in any political coalition, there are decisions which are the purview of the political party individually, because the decision is the decision that affects that party, although to a certain extent it also affects the coalition. There are decisions that have wider ramifications across the coalition, and therefore there must be a consensus between the members of the coalition. In the context of Kajamu, the decision to vacate a seat is a PKR's decision, because the seat is PKR's seat. In the same way, for example, if PAS decides to use any of its seats as part of political strategy, it is PAS's right, so long as PAS informs other coalition members. Unless, for example, it's going to be different, if we want to do a by-election, but instead of vacating our seats, we actually ask a seat from the AP or PAS, then it's going to be different. There has been the understanding that the leeway must be given to the individual party to decide within its boundary what it can be done. And Kajang is a PKR seat. A decision to vacate is a PKR decision. And we have informed both DAP and PAS. And of course, you are not privy to the discussions behind the scene or discussions within Pakatan. When the decision to vacate was informed, there was an agreement, an acknowledgement, because that decision is the decision of PKR because it involves a PKR seat. And it's very clear. Because if you read all the sections in the Constitution, the overriding consideration of a monarch to appoint a Menteri Besar in Selangor is who commands a majority. In the case of Selangor, that show of, or that test of majority was clearly proven and demonstrated when 30 aduns, complete with a signed statutory declaration, appeared physically in public in show of support of Wan Aziza. If you fall back to the federal court decision in the aftermath of the Perak crisis, it was clearly shown and clearly established that the Sultan or monarch can resort to extra, what's the word? Extra, thanks John. Monarch can resort to extra parliamentary means in order to establish support, a majority support. By extra parliamentary means, it means that it can actually call one by one, or better still, if there is a letter, in the case of Perak, the federal court confirms that a letter, a simple letter from Adun, is sufficient as a show of support for a particular candidate. That was why the decision, taking into account advices by constitutional expert, was that all the 30 Adun should sign statutory declaration, because that was over and above the requirement that was clarified by federal court on how sultans and monarchs should resort in order to decide majority support. Which means what? Which means you may argue that the state constitutions leave some ambiguity, the likely and so on, but anyone with some legal background and legal expertise knows that you interpret a state constitution together with the federal constitution, together with judgment and cases relating to a similar issue. So you have to take into account the federal court decisions of 2009. The federal court decisions of 2009 clarifies what the phrase likely to command a majority support, which means the Sultan has to establish whether through parliamentary means on the floor or through extra parliamentary means. What are the extra parliamentary means? Letter, or in the case of Selangor, the show of support through 30 signed statutory declarations, and all the 30 Aduns actually appeared physically, publicly to show their support for Wan Hasila. Which means what? There is no ambiguity whatsoever in the state constitution. Pakatan Rakyat has adhered word by word to the provision of state constitution. Unfortunately, that state constitution was not applied when the palace appointed a Menteri Besar. So you have to be careful, and that's why in the aftermath of Selangor crisis, we go back and discuss internally. The consensus so far is that the constitution, when read together with the federal constitution and all the cases, constitutional cases, this view that there is ambiguity in the state constitution that requires amendments is not valid after all. It's very clear. The state constitution is very clear. That's why the question from Alan is very applicable as well. Given that background, how Pakatan Rakyat is going to manage if there is possible crisis when the state constitution is not adhered to by the monarch. Your third question, aku dah lupa apa dia third question. Perkataan-perkataan yang kena ban. Perkataan-perkataan yang kena ban ni, in the case of Selangor ada 12, I think, but 12, solat and so on. It was introduced by UMNO way back then. The enactment was passed by UMNO in 1988. In fact, it was never enforced. I think this is where, when it has to be a consensus, then we have to fall back to consensus. You ask whether Pakatan Rakyat is going to change the law or not. That process, the decision whether or not to repeal that enactment, has to go back to Pakatan Rakyat, which means it has to get the consensus of the three parties, the AP, PAS, and PKR, because the ramifications involve the three parties. It's not a decision that PKR can make alone, or PAS can make alone, or the AP can make alone. I can tell you there is no consensus for the time being. That's why it's left there. There are parties which want the repeal, and there are parties which says that better leave it there. And in matters where consensus has to be achieved, then we have to respect that principle. It's a matter of policy. It's a matter of political risk that all the three parties have to weigh together collectively. And I think for the time being, there is no consensus as yet. Maybe Nick can add a bit more.
I think I just mentioned shortly, all these questions are, what do you call that, very unpleasant for me. But I think it's the most relevant for me to answer. First of all, I mean, the issue of FB, I mean, it's very clear. It's a constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy. I mean, you go back to those principles and the fact that why it has never been an issue before in the appointment of Menteri Besar in the country to this very point, you know, the asking for more than one candidate and all that. Yes, only be an issue now. There's nothing wrong about the state constitution. So I think that is very clear. And about the enactment, the Selangor state enactment, it is very tricky because as a Malay state, i.e. a state with a Malay ruler, matters of religion especially, it has some relation to do with the Malay ruler, i.e. the Sultan. And since, you know, with all the state that we are in, I don't think that we are in a position to pick that battle, and especially when there is no Pakatan consensus. The state of the matter before this, it was enacted in 1988 by the BN government, but at the same time, the Mahathir administration assured the minorities that it would not be enforced. You know, so there was some sort of deal, including with the Malay Bible and all those matters. But when Pakatan came into power, then unfortunately, you know, those things, and it was totally outside our control, you know, all these things came to head. So it is very delicate and it will take some time to unravel.
I think we have time for about 1 or 2 more questions. 1 or 2?
There's another one. 3.
3? Okay, we'll leave it at those 3 for the rest of the evening. Okay.
I just wanted to ask, how do we balance Article 153 and how is Article 153 going to stay relevant in Malaysia now, and how do we balance developing Malaysia and Article 153? Yeah, you can answer it short. What is the top 3 things currently each of you are doing for your people, your people in the state or Adun? What is the top 3 agenda? Second is especially to see what is the job growth percentage in Baru or in
Yeah, no problem.
He knows, nobody knows.
Anyway, Pakatan is the ruling government in Penang, right? So you should do it faster. Third question is, what is your view about the trade of ISIL in Malaysia? About Ebola outbreak, since we have a lot of African students, and about MH17 being shot down by.
That's the 6th question.
So the first one is, what are you doing for your people who elected you? Second thing is, it's more about our future. If you were to go back to Malaysia, what are the things that attract us to go back, which is basically job opportunity. The third thing is about a view. If Pakatan were to be the government of Malaysia, we should have a view about, not just about what is bad about Yen or monarchy, but a global view about how to rule the country, right?
Yeah, so there's that last election in gerrymandering. So as far as I understand, even though Pakistan won 52% of the vote, still lost because of the gerrymandering, the way the seats are distributed on Malaysia. I brought this up in the last lecture, the one of my politics tutorials here at AMU. And my tutor actually pointed out that this used to be a big problem in Australia as well, earlier on. But then the Australian Electoral Commission went on to reform and redistribute and redraw the line between the electorates. My question was, do you think electoral reform in Malaysia can go far enough that such thing can happen? And will it be useful for Malaysia?
Okay, the first question was on 153 and about developing Malaysia. 153 is the provision where the Malays and the Bumi Putras of Sabah and Sarawak are provided a special position. Actually, the provision is very narrow. It's not an all-encompassing provision in the Constitution. Even it's mentioned, the powers for the king to limit quotas to maintain the presence of the Malays and Bumi Putras are in only certain segments. So, and it was never a big issue. I think the more major issue is the new economic policy. And that is not part of the Constitution. So we have to separate the two things. You have to read about Dr. Ismail, who was the deputy president of UMNO, the deputy prime minister. Even he acknowledged that even to the point of he was willing to see even the issue of 153 is like a golfing handicap. It's about the position of the communities, and that maybe it will be irrelevant one day. But so for me, I don't see a major problem of maintaining 153 and developing Malaysia. But first, the new economic policy, which is much more extensive than 153, that is a Pakatan consensus, and keadilan pioneered it, i.e. that it has to go. We need to replace that from a race-based affirmative action policy to a needs-based affirmative action policy. Yes, the majority of the poor are largely Malays and Bumi Putras of Sabah and Sarawak, and they will get the necessary benefit, but not the cronies and the politically connected ones. So I think if we can implement that, then and supposedly, even Najib has agreed to it with the new economic model, although it has not been implemented. So if we can agree to that, I don't see any major problem of developing the country, and perhaps 153 can be maintained as part and parcel of the identity of the country, and as it is. I don't see that as a major problem. Just briefly about your question about the three things that we are focused at. For me personally, first of all, fighting racial, race-based politics is to me a major issue, because we are so divided, and that's one of the main reasons. If you ask me why did I join Keadilan much more than Anwar Ibrahim and all that, it was because I saw that it is the most viable and political party because of its multiracial identity. And at that time, it was still very small. It only had 5 seats and all Malay seats. But I knew that you had to have a Malay majority multiracial party to succeed, because only then the society can accept it. So that was my personal feeling, and I believe that we still have a long way to go, but Keadilan certainly has achieved. We are now 50% Malay, our membership of 500,000, 20% Indian, 15% Chinese, and the balance are Sabah and Sarawak Bumis. Secondly is education, because I think that those were the few things that we got right when we were independent education. But we've strayed away from those achievements, and it has affected our performance. If we can really go back to that, it will make a lot of difference for the ordinary Malaysian. So that's why in my constituency I started a voluntary tuition project, because there's a lot. My constituency is urban, it's PJ, but there's low-cost flats, and these things make a lot of difference in the society there. Thirdly, if you ask me, it's related to your other issue that you asked us now. It's about religious moderation. I think that is something that is again because of the racial politics that is being intertwined, and it makes it very difficult for us to articulate a proper, moderate position when there was never that much of a problem in the past. But sadly, we are not standing up to extremists. UMNO is simply backing down or making use of it for their political use. In terms of the Ebola, MH17, I'm not to leave it to the rest, but I don't think there's been a major Ebola outbreak, to be fair to our health minister in Malaysia. So I think that is where we have perhaps done well. But yeah, I mean, so ISIL is serious actually. That one we need to do more, and I think it's actually related to the way the politics is being handled back home, that it has contributed to that number, because we have actually the same number of ISIL fighters as Indonesia, although we have a far, far smaller population. So that is quite worrying.
Okay, for the first question about 153, I think majority of the, I'm Chinese, and then, of all the leaders in Pakatan, we have no problem with 153, and we respect the constitutional rights of the Malays, and that is reached in a consensus during independence. And what we are hoping is to have what you call a more equitable, where everyone is treated fairly. We just don't like Pakasa to ask me migrate keluar dari negara, okay? That's about it, okay? But however, is that we also have to contribute into the process. We have to have participate in this democratic transition. That leads to the second question: is that what do I do? Top 3 things that I do is that we participate together with our brothers and sisters, the Malays, the Chinese, the Indians, the Sawahan, and Sarawakian, Bumiputras, together, okay, in building a nation that truly belongs to us. That is very important. Because if you decided to just say politics is not my business, other people will take over, right? So if you don't do this, no one don't ask other people to do it for you. You have to do it together. That's why we are together here. I also joined a multiracial party called Parti Keadilan Rakyat, because I feel the idealism and all the the environment, which is important to bring the nation to the next level. About jobs in Penang, I can assure you, who else are engineers? Please raise your hand. Okay, you all get the job, no problem. Okay, I can offer you a job now. So, plenty of jobs, okay, in Penang, and I would like to invite you guys to go back. Don't stay too long here, okay? I know the weather is nice, the food is nice, but it's pretty boring here. Sorry, John. Sorry. So, you see, another thing is, I see many people that didn't raise up your hand. Don't worry, you also have a job, because Parti Keadilan is recruiting. So anyway, we are going to jail anyways very soon, obviously. So plenty of seats for you to contest. Yeah. So that's we have to put the idealism, because what are the things that we also do is that to inspire, not to inspire. I have nothing to inspire you guys, but I hope to draw the experience from China, from India, from other countries. In China, when Sun Yat-sen formed the First Republic of China, he was a student in overseas. Okay, Mahatma Gandhi also became the leader when he was in England and in South Africa. Jokowi, stood up to the challenge and bring a new hope for Indonesia. And a lot of other countries, leaders are from the students. So hopefully one day, you guys can join us, participate in this democratic process. This is very, very interesting at this point. And we in Keadilan always feel inspired by the comradeship, the friendship, that we are every day we're doing something interesting to change Malaysia in education policies, in transportation policies, in bringing hope and what we call this multiracial politics to the forefront of the debate. And in terms of gerrymandering, okay, sorry, what was the question on this?
Gerrymandering.
No, there's another transportation problem issue, right? MH17. What's your question? Comment on MH17. Rest in peace. Okay. And I think Australian has been 370 and MH17. Australia has been a very, very good friend to Malaysia, and we also appreciate it. We also conveyed to the foreign minister just now when we met her, and you know, these are the things that truly inspire everyone. You know, a country, you know, standing up to help the other country. This is where friendship is all about. And this gerrymandering, okay. We are fighting a war. It's very difficult because this is a democracy. The principle of democracy is one man, one vote. And however, in Malaysia, one man doesn't equal to one vote in Malaysia. And that is where the problem is. When you win 52% of the popular votes, but you went into the parliament only 40% of the seats, and you know that this system is unfair. Okay, so this is where we have to stand up as the people. In about 7 years ago, nobody know about this one man one vote. Okay, before per se was born, nobody cares about one man one vote. And what the small group of people who are continually championing one man one vote, and it catches on like fire. And we have per se 2, per se 3 that draws 500,000 of 250,000, 250,000 people on the street. That is remarkable. Okay, and finally, although we are not successful, but you ask anyone on the street, do you agree with one man one vote? They will say yes. Okay, you want to reform SPR? Yes. And what do? SPR must reform. So this is where people power and empowerment is all about. You have a voice, you need to say that, and push for reform in this electoral reform. Very soon, in about 1 month's time, probably they will table a new gerrymandering. And this is going to be very critical for us, because every time they do a delineation exercise, Barisan Nasional won big. In 2004, they created another 20 seats. 1 seat was won by DA3, 19 seats were won by Barisan Nasional. That's how they create the seats. And this is very, very unfair. And it is impossible that everyone, it is a must for everyone to pay attention to this, because you want your votes to carry weight. One of the solutions to this is that another very important thing is that your parliament is increasing. If let's say you add another 20 seats, 25 seats in the parliament, actually the parliament becomes too big and voices are diluted. Let me tell you how long we speak in parliament, okay? To voice out your issue from Penang or from Bayan Baru. You are from Bayan Baru, are you? No, okay. So, you see, budget is the most important thing in the parliament debate. However, parliamentarians, on average, they only have 10 minutes to speak on this budget. Sometimes junior MPs only have 5 minutes to speak about. How can you voice out in parliament just 5 minutes, speaking the most important bill of the year? Only 5 minutes. Okay, and if you add, that is because of 222 parliamentarians wants to speak. Let's say they add another 30 seats. I think on average, each MP only speaks about 3 minutes. So bigger parliament doesn't mean that be better. Okay, and in America, the parliament, the congressman in 1911, there was 435 parliament, congressmen in the parliament, US parliament. Today, 2014, there's also 435 congressmen in parliament. They have never added for almost 100 years, okay, any seats, because they want to make sure that the parliament is effective, that the voices can be heard. Thank you.
Sorry, just a few words before, the rest conclude. I usually leave the last one to the heavyweight. Yeah. So, heavyweight carries two meanings. I think, apart from a multiracial party, that's important. I think it's beyond that, what Parti Keadilan Rakyat is struggling. My personal feeling is that we are together not because just because Rafizi is Malay, or just because Sim is a Chinese, or so on, but also we are struggling for, I would say it's more like a class-based struggles, which means when Anwar came up with an idea, Ketuanan Rakyat, to replace Ketuanan Melayu, I think it's one of the greatest fundamental change to political landscape in Malaysia. So, Rakyat, in the sense of we are struggling for ordinary people like you, like me. We are struggling for people that has been oppressed by the regime. We are struggling for the people that is underprivileged. So I think that's more important, the meaning of solidarity that of the struggles. And also at the same time, I'm thinking that maybe, not all should join politics. I don't think that is right, even most of us might go to jail later. Just do whatever you like, but do not forget where you are coming from. I think that's very important. Our root, when we talk about tanah air, I think it's not just about the soil and the water, but I think air also means tears. When we were together for Bersih Rally in KL, I'm not sure whether you were there, but when we all sang Negaraku together, I'm sure it's very electrifying. The feeling, the solidarity that we are having together. We are not sure what will happen next week, but we are always optimistic. If not, we won't be here. So we really hope to see you guys again. Thank you.
I may be heavy now, but 16 years ago I was thinner than you guys, so don't laugh too soon. I think a lot have been answered. There's one question about the employment rate, which I thought was quite. I don't think there is any employment rate that is track specific to constituency. However, there is a national unemployment rate, not employment rate, unemployment rate. Generally, Malaysia's unemployment rate has been about 2%, 2 to 3%. Unemployment rate usually refers to if you were to look for a job, can you get a job or not? So at 2 or 3%, basically Malaysia is as good as having zero unemployment. Anyone can get a job. But of course that's not really the case on the ground. The issue is not so much whether there is enough job, whether the job match your expectation, your skill, your salary and so on. Job mismatch will continue to be an issue. Part of it is because our economy has been built on cheap foreign labours, and as our workforce, I think tactically, PKR position has been quite clear that we are against additional seats, because additional seats means redrawing the boundary. And redrawing the boundary will mean that opening a floodgate and Pandora's box for Election Commission and PN to gerrymander even further. Of course, should we win election one day, then the question is very simple. What we need to do is to reconstitute as well the Election Commission to make sure that it is independent, it is accountable to the public, and it is honest. Once you have that, then I think you can adopt so many ways that countries in the world have taken steps to make sure that there is equity in votes between various constituencies in a country. Although I have to also remind, in the context of Malaysia, we cannot go blindly with one member, one vote. We also have to take into account specific considerations, for example, rural bias. You cannot do away completely with rural bias, which is there are places, rural areas, which may need bigger representation because they need more attention, because they have been left behind for quite a while. There are communities, especially in Sabah and Sarawak, which will continue to require more attention from the government for some foreseeable future until the imbalance is corrected. So this can be done quite easily. What cannot be done, what is most difficult to do, is to get rid of the current election commission, put in an honest election commission. Until you have that, I think it's rather hostile and rather counterproductive to even talk about ways to balance the inequity in between states now. I've been asked to wrap up. It's 8:15. Let me put it this way. I think you guys are very lucky. You certainly know what's happening in Malaysia. I think only crazy undergraduates come to listen to politicians at 8:15 during weekdays. Before exam some more. But then again, you have a stake in the society. We always thought that a decision will always be made by people who show up. That's something that you must drill in your head. The greatest strategy, if you go through this good, upbringing, exposed to good education, and you go back and you withdraw into your comfort, and with your good house, good mortgage, good job, you remain an armchair critic who complains about everything and anything, but you will not lift a finger to do anything at all. That is, I think, a tragedy for Malaysia. So you may decide whatever you want to do. You may become the biggest supporter of Najib Razak. There is no problem with it. Go ahead. You may like Adilan. You may join or set up a new party. That's your choice. But it is better to make a choice, take up steps, make a difference, rather than just take a step back and just hold it. And I think that is our wishes to you. Because, I know you make jokes about us going to prison and so on, but it's true. Given the current condition and situation, the burnout rate of politicians in Malaysia is actually quite high. We may go up very quickly, but we may be imprisoned very quickly as well. And we are taken off the political scene very quickly as well. So the fate of the country relies heavily on how quick we can churn out good politicians with good skills, people with conscience who step forward and honestly want to make a difference, regardless of which party or which path do you choose to. That is, I think, the value of your education and upbringing. And if everyone in this room have that view in mind, and you go back and you take actions at least to make a difference, I think all your questions that have been posted today, I think can be resolved rather easily in the future. Thank you very much. It's been an honor. I hope to see you later. Good luck with your exam.
Before I just make a few quick winding up remarks, I believe that there's a further meeting going to take place after this on the Malaysian progressives in Australia. So if you're interested in taking part in that, you're welcome to do so. But for the moment, just let me say that it's been a great pleasure indeed to see so many of you here attending and participating so enthusiastically. in this discussion on Malaysia. The Political and Social Change Department hopes to increase the focus that we have on Malaysian matters. Indeed, next month the Deputy Prime Minister is scheduled to come here to sign an agreement on, I have to look at this because it keeps changing, the Global Malaysian Studies Network at ANU. It's a joint venture between ANU and UKM in Malaysia, which hopefully will be something that can contribute to giving more focus on Malaysian studies, which is something that we're very anxious to do. Having said that, may I ask you all to join in thanking the panel for giving the excellent presentation that they had. And let's see you back again soon.